They called it an experiment. I called it a test of dignity. In 1941, when the War Department announced the creation of a new flying unit, they didn't call it a squadron, they called it an experiment in coloured aviation. Newspapers repeated the phrase, officers whispered it behind closed doors, and somewhere a few men probably laughed. I remember the day the orders came. There was no applause, no speech of honour, only silence thick with doubt. They didn't expect us to win. They expected us to fail. My name is Benjamin Oliver Davis Jr., commander of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first all-black flying unit in the United States Army Air Forces. I was chosen not because they believed in me, but because they wanted proof that their prejudice was right. The air in Tuskegee, Alabama was heavy, humid, and still, as if the land itself held its breath to see whether we would rise or fall. The buildings were small, the paint peeling from the hangars, the runways lined with dust. Yet, within those walls, I saw young men whose eyes carried something the enemy could never shoot down: resolve. We had been told we were inferior, that our minds were unfit for machinery, and our hearts too timid for war. But those accusations only forged our discipline. Every insult became a lesson in endurance, every slight a reason to fly straighter. As I looked at those men, mechanics, cadets, and pilots, I understood that our true battle would not begin in the skies over Europe, but right there, in the quiet fields of Alabama. We were not fighting just for victory. We were fighting for recognition, for the right to exist in a country that doubted our worth. They called it an experiment. I called it the moment America's conscience took flight. At West Point, silence was my only companion. For 4 years, not one cadet spoke to me outside of official duty. In the dining hall, I ate alone. On the parade ground, I marched in a line of voices that never called my name. But that silence, as cruel as it was, became my teacher. It taught me patience, control, and how to stand tall without applause. I learned that respect could not be demanded. It had to be earned through excellence. When I later arrived in Tuskegee, Alabama in 1941, that same silence followed me, but the air was different here. The sun beat down like a hammer, turning the red clay to dust. The hangars were small, the engines second-hand, and the equipment older than the men who trained with it. Yet I could feel something stirring beneath the heat and hardship, a quiet defiance. The program itself was born out of politics, not faith. Public Law 18 of 1939 had forced the government to include black colleges in the civilian pilot training program. It was never meant to create combat pilots. It was meant to appease pressure, to make it look like progress. But the men who came to Tuskegee weren't there for appearances. They came to fly. We trained harder and longer than any other group in the Army Air Forces, 300 hours in the cockpit before combat, compared to 200 for white cadets. Our washout rate was 60%. Many walked away broken, but those who stayed became something rarer than pilots. They became symbols of endurance. Every sunrise brought new drills, every sunset another inspection. Sweat and oil stained our uniforms, but our discipline never faltered. When the day ended, and the field fell silent except for the hum of crickets, I often stood alone, staring at the empty runway glowing in moonlight. It reminded me of West Point. The same silence, but now it felt different. Back then, it had been isolation. Here, it was focus. The silence at West Point had trained me for this. We would speak through performance. By early 1943, our orders came through. The 99th Pursuit Squadron was to deploy to North Africa. We packed our gear in silence, aware that this was more than just another assignment. It was Judgment Day. The man we reported to, Colonel William Momia of the 33rd Fighter Group, made no secret of his doubts. He called us an experiment in uniform, and his eyes carried the quiet expectation that we'd fail before we even took off. When we landed in Tunisia, the desert stretched endless and pale under a sun that burned without mercy. Sand crept into our engines, our boots, even our thoughts. The air smelled of oil and dust. Yet the moment I stepped onto that foreign soil, I felt the full weight of the history we carried. 13 million Americans back home who would be judged by whatever happened next. Our first mission came on June 2nd, 1943, an attack on the Italian-held island of Pantelleria. We climbed into our P-40 Warhawks, planes already considered outdated, their engines coughing smoke as we taxied down the strip. My men said little. Their faces were a mix of fear and focus. As we took off, radio static filled the headsets. The sun glared off the sea like shards of broken glass. We found no enemy fighters that day, only anti-aircraft fire from the island below. The bombers released their loads, and we circled tight, keeping formation exactly as trained. When we returned to base, the ground crew waited in silence. No kills, no headlines, just the smell of fuel and sweat. But as I looked at every aircraft parked safely in a row, not one missing, not one burning, I felt something steady inside me. We hadn't lost a plane. That was victory enough for now. Still, I knew the truth. One mistake, one lost pilot, and Washington would call the whole program a failure. We were fighting two wars that day, one over Pantelleria and one for the right to stay in the sky. July the 2nd, 1943, Sicily. The morning air shimmered with heat, the horizon a haze of blue and dust. Our mission was to escort B-25 Mitchell bombers striking the Castelvetrono airfield. It was Lieutenant Charles B. Hall's 8th mission. His P-40L Warhawk climbed beside mine, sunlight flashing off its wings. The radio crackled with clipped voices, tension carried in every word. Over the target, the bombers dropped their payloads, and then came the hunters. Two Focke-Wulf 190s dove out of the sun, their cannons spitting fire. Hall saw them first. 2 o'clock high! Closing fast! His voice cut through the static. I banked hard, feeling the G-force press against my chest. The sky exploded in tracer fire, white smoke curling like scars across the blue. Hall turned inside the lead German, rolling the Warhawk until his sights aligned. A burst, sharp, steady, and the enemy aircraft shuddered, flames trailing from its fuselage as it spiraled down toward the Sicilian earth. Over the radio came Hall's voice, breathless but steady. "I got one!" For a moment, there was only silence. No cheers, no words, just the steady hum of engines over the sea. When we landed, the ground crew ran toward us. Then the silence broke. Men shouted, clapped, lifted Hall from the cockpit as if the weight of history itself had just taken flight. I didn't smile, I simply watched. That bullet had torn through more than metal. It had torn through centuries of doubt. In that instant, one young man from Brazil, Indiana, had done what generations had been told was impossible. Hall became the first black pilot in US military history to shoot down an enemy aircraft. But beyond the records, beyond the statistics, it meant something far deeper. It told every man standing on that dusty Sicilian airfield that excellence could speak louder than prejudice. As the sun set and the smell of burnt fuel drifted through the camp, I wrote a single line in my logbook. It wasn't just Hall's victory. It was proof of existence. After Hall's victory, the newspapers back home printed a few polite lines about progress, but at headquarters, the mood was far colder. Colonel Momier filed a report that cut deeper than any bullet. He claimed our pilots lacked aggressiveness, that we were unfit for serious combat. His words reached General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces. I later learned that Arnold was prepared to shut us down, to end the experiment before it could truly begin. But fate, or perhaps history itself, gave us one last chance. Anzio, January 27th, 1944. The beachhead was chaos, a narrow strip of Italy where Allied troops clung to the shore under constant German fire. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies, and our orders were simple: hold them back. We had only 15 P-40s, engines old and patched, their paint dulled by sand and salt. Against us were sleek, deadly Focke-Wulf 190s, faster, newer, deadlier. As we climbed into the winter sky, the cold bit through our gloves, and the clouds ahead burned with sunlight like molten glass. I remember the first attack, grey shapes diving out of the glare, tracer rounds snapping past my canopy. "Break left! Break left!" the radio screamed. The sky turned into a spinning storm of smoke and metal. Every instinct said to run, but discipline kept us steady. We fought in pairs, covering each other's tails, climbing, rolling, firing in bursts. For 20 minutes, the air above Anzio was alive with fire. When it ended, the sky fell silent except for the crackle of the radio. "That's another one smoking," someone shouted. Reports came in. 8, maybe 13 enemy aircraft down, not one of ours lost. When we landed, the ground crew stared wide-eyed. For the first time, they didn't look at us as an experiment. They looked at us as equals. Later that night, as I wrote the day's report by lantern light, the words came slowly. For the first time, I wrote, I saw respect in their eyes, and that was worth every risk. The Battle of Anzio had done more than save the beachhead, it had saved the Tuskegee Airmen. By May 1944, the 99th Fighter Squadron was no longer alone. We were joined with the 100th, 31st and 302nd to form the 322nd Fighter Group, a single, unified force under one banner. The mission was clear: escort the heavy bombers of the 15th Air Force deep into enemy territory. These weren't short-range skirmishes anymore. They were 1,000-mile journeys across Europe, where a mistake meant vanishing into smoke. The day I took command, I gathered every pilot and ground crew at Ramitelli Airfield. The Adriatic wind carried the smell of oil and sea salt, and the men stood in silence, their goggles hanging around their necks. I told them what would become our code. Our job is not to be aces. Our job is to bring those bombers home. It wasn't the kind of order that stirred cheers, but it was the one that saved lives. In June, General Nathan Twining ordered each fighter group to be marked with its own colour for quick identification. Our Mustangs were given red, not just the propeller spinners or nosebands, but the entire tail section. When the paint dried under the Italian sun, I watched as rows of crimson tails gleamed against the grey of the runway. It was supposed to be a simple marking system, but the colour did something unexpected. It gave us identity. From the first time those bombers saw us climbing beside them, flashes of red in the sunlight, word spread fast. If you can, get the red tails. They never leave you. Every mission reinforced the legend. We stayed close when others chased glory, guarded formation when others broke off for kills. And though the world still saw us through the lens of colour in the skies, that red tail became something different, a promise. They had painted our planes red so command could tell who we were. They didn't know that, in doing so, they had given us something greater. They gave us a symbol of who we chose to be. They gave us red tails to identify us. They didn't know it would become a mark of pride. July 18th, 1944. Memmingen, Germany. The morning began like many others, a pale sun rising over the Adriatic as we prepped for another bomber escort. But this mission would test everything we'd built. 66 of our P-51 Mustangs were assigned to protect a formation of B-17s, striking a Luftwaffe base deep in Bavaria. As we crossed into enemy airspace, I could feel the tension in the radio silence. The bombers were late, and fuel was already running low. I ordered the group to orbit above the clouds until they arrived. Then, on the horizon, silver glints appeared, not the bombers, but fighters. 100 German aircraft, Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, coming in waves from every direction. The radio erupted into chaos. "Break left! They're diving out of the sun!" Static swallowed half the words. The sky turned to fire. I saw tracers cut across the bombers, black smoke spiralling upward as engines burst. We dove to intercept, Mustangs screaming through the air, wings vibrating under the strain. The smell of cordite filled the cockpit. My vision narrowed to the gun sight. "Watch your six!" I shouted. A flash! One German fighter disintegrated under a burst from Lieutenant Lee Archer. Another went down trailing smoke. For 20 minutes the sky over Memmingen was nothing but thunder. 11, maybe 12 German fighters fell that day, but the price was heavy. 3 of my men, Lieutenants Robert Hutton, Wellington Irving and Alfred Brown, never came back. When the last enemy broke off, I looked down and saw 15 B-17s burning in the fields below. Yet without us, it would have been all of them. Back at base, reports came in. We'd lost more bombers than usual, but less than anyone expected for such a massive ambush. Command called it a tactical success. I called it survival. That night, as I sat beside the flight log, the sound of the Adriatic wind filled the tent. The faces of my lost pilots stayed with me. People often talk about leadership in terms of victory or glory. They forget the quiet moments that follow, the silence where every name weighs heavier than medals. Leadership, I wrote that night, is not about killing the enemy. It's about bringing your men home. July 18th, 1944. Memmingen, Germany. The morning began like many others, a pale sun rising over the Adriatic as we prepped for another bomber escort. But this mission would test everything we'd built. 66 of our P-51 Mustangs were assigned to protect a formation of B-17s, striking a Luftwaffe base deep in Bavaria. As we crossed into enemy airspace, I could feel the tension in the radio silence. The bombers were late and fuel was already running low. I ordered the group to orbit above the clouds until they arrived. Then, on the horizon, silver glints appeared. Not the bombers, but fighters. 100 German aircraft, Fokker-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, coming in waves from every direction. The radio erupted into chaos. "Break left, they're diving out of the sun." Static swallowed half the words. The sky turned to fire. I saw tracers cut across the bombers, black smoke spiralling upward as engines burst. We dove to intercept, Mustangs screaming through the air, wings vibrating under the strain. The smell of cordite filled the cockpit. My vision narrowed to the gun sight. "Watch your six!" I shouted. A flash. One German fighter disintegrated under a burst from Lieutenant Lee Archer. Another went down trailing smoke. For 20 minutes the sky over Memmingen was nothing but thunder. 11, maybe 12 German fighters fell that day, but the price was heavy. 3 of my men, Lieutenants Robert Hutton, Wellington Irving and Alfred Brown, never came back. When the last enemy broke off, I looked down and saw 15 B-17s burning in the fields below. Yet without us, it would have been all of them. Back at base, reports came in. We'd lost more bombers than usual, but less than anyone expected for such a massive ambush. Command called it a tactical success. I called it survival. That night, as I sat beside the flight log, the sound of the Adriatic wind filled the tent. The faces of my lost pilots stayed with me. People often talk about leadership in terms of victory or glory. They forget the quiet moments that follow, the silence where every name weighs heavier than medals. Leadership, I wrote that night, is not about killing the enemy. It's about bringing your men home. March 24th, 1945. Berlin. The final act of a long war. Our orders were clear. Escort the bombers to the Daimler-Benz tank factory, 1,600 miles round trip. Intelligence warned us that the Luftwaffe had deployed its new secret weapon, the Messerschmitt Me-262's jet fighter. It could fly at over 540 miles per hour, faster than anything we had ever faced. 43 of our P-51 Mustangs lifted off from Ramitelli that morning, engines roaring in perfect rhythm. As we climbed over the Alps, the radio stayed quiet. Too quiet. I could feel the tension building like static in the air. Near Berlin, the first shadows appeared, silver arrows cutting through the clouds. The jets came in fast, flashing past us before most men could even react. Their speed was unreal. "They're coming around again, 10 o'clock high," someone shouted. We turned into them, not away. I saw Lieutenant Roscoe Brown's Mustang pull into a steep climb, his red tail glinting against the sun. He turned into the jet's blind spot and fired. A long, perfect burst. The Me-262 shuddered, then burst into flame. "He's bailing out!" Brown's voice broke through the static. A moment later, Lieutenant Earl Lane lined up his shot, deflection calculated perfectly by the new K-14 gun sight. His burst tore through another jet from 2,000 yards out, a shot pilots called impossible. The third kill came from Lieutenant Charles Brantley, who caught an Me-262 trying to climb away. 3 German jets destroyed, more in one day than most groups managed in the entire war. When we landed, the airmen on the field stood watching in silence. For a moment, even the engines seemed to hold their breath. The 322nd Fighter Group had just done what no one thought possible. Command awarded us the Distinguished Unit Citation for that mission. I still remember writing the report that night, my hand trembling slightly over the page. They said no propeller plane could catch a jet. They were wrong. That day our red tails didn't just protect bombers, they tore through history itself. That day our red tails cut through the future. Victory came slowly, and with it, irony. By the spring of 1945, our record spoke for itself. 112 enemy aircraft destroyed, only 27 bombers lost under our escort compared to 46 for other groups, 66 pilots killed in action, 32 captured, numbers that should have silenced every critic. And yet, the silence that followed felt hollow. One of those captured was Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson. He was shot down over southern France and taken to Stalag Luft III, a German prisoner of war camp. When he returned after the war, He told me something that stayed with me for the rest of my life. In a Nazi camp, he said, I was treated more equally than in my own country. I didn't know what to say. Jefferson described how the German officers interrogated him with precision and discipline, even referring to him as lieutenant. Inside that camp, white American prisoners who once doubted his worth now shared bread and stories with him. They no longer saw a Negro pilot. They saw a man who had kept them alive in the skies. But when Jefferson came home, he was met with a rope line separating black soldiers from white. The same old signs, coloured and white, guarding the same doors. That was the world we fought for. The irony cut deeper than any wound. The Red Tails had proven that courage had no colour, yet America still wore its blindfold. I remember walking through the airfield after the war ended. Rows of Mustangs parked silent under the evening sun. Their red tails glowed faintly in the fading light, symbols of something greater than victory. We had done everything asked of us and more. We'd fought the Luftwaffe and won. But as I looked toward the horizon, I knew there was another war waiting for us, one without medals, one without parades. We had won the war overseas. The one at home would take much longer. After the war, the noise of engines faded, but the silence that followed carried a different kind of weight. Many of our men returned home to find that victory abroad did not mean acceptance at home. Yet history has a way of catching up to truth. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially ending racial segregation in the United States Armed Forces. The order was more than policy. It was recognition. It was the first time our country admitted in law what we had already proven in the sky, that courage and competence know no colour. For me, the years that followed were quieter but no less meaningful. I stayed in uniform, building what would become a new United Air Force. In 1954, I stood on a parade ground once more, the wind tugging at my hat as I was promoted to Brigadier General, the first black general in the history of the US Air Force. It wasn't pride I felt that day, but completion, the sense that the long silence of West Point had finally been answered. Decades later, in 2007, I stood again among my brothers, older now, our hair silver, our steps slower. In the great rotunda of the US Capitol, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen received the Congressional Gold Medal. The applause rolled like thunder through the hall, and the sound 50 years overdue. Some of the men we honoured that day had waited their whole lives to hear it. As I looked around, I thought of the faces that weren't there, the 66 who never came home, the 32 who endured captivity, and all the young men who carried our story forward. I realised then that what we built wasn't just a squadron, it was a statement that dignity once earned cannot be denied. We didn't fight to prove we were better. We fought to prove we were equal, and when our red tails flew over Berlin, the world finally saw that we were.